Today I have with me author Greer Macallister, and Greer's newest book, which you can see in the background behind her head, is Girl in Disguise. And I wish I had a copy, but Amazon sent it somewhere else, so I don't have a copy, but I listened to it on audio, and I am so excited to talk to you about this book, Greer. It was, I mean, you don't need me to tell you how amazing it was, because everybody's telling you that, but just in case you need one more person, I will tell you how amazing it was. I never heard. I never heard this story, you know, and I always ask people when I come upon a new story like this, and I'm like, did you ever hear of the Pinkerton Detective Agency? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, okay. I somehow in my history, I missed it. And I am so happy that you wrote a story about it, because it made me watch some YouTube videos on it and get some background. And it's such an important part of our history that I'm so happy to get to know about it. But of course, the biggest question, I'm sure the one that you always get asked, is how did you find it?
I always get asked this question, and I always wish I had a better answer. So I was generally aware of the Pinkertons, but I had never heard the name Kate Warne up until about, it was after my first book, The Magician's Lie, came out, and I was trying to figure out what I was going to write next. And I ran across, I think, just a random mention somewhere on the vast internet of Kate Warne, the first female Pinkerton detective. And of course, my first thought was, why haven't I ever heard of this woman? So I started looking into what she had done, and she helped save Abraham Lincoln's life. She was a detective. She was a spy. She was a boss of lady detectives in 1858, like way before you would think that kind of thing was accepted or practical. And when I talked to my editor about it, she's like, yes, like, write that book. People want to know. People hear first female Pinkerton detective and they go, ooh, what's her deal? So this is why I wrote Her Deal.
Well, before we start talking about that, I just want to mention that your first published book, I should say, I don't know how to, say it, but it's also behind you, The Magician's Lie. That is coming out in a movie. It got bought for a movie, right?
It did, yes. So, and we never know, like, when these things will happen, if they ever happen, and a lot of stuff never actually makes it to the screen. But I am super excited because it was one of the first books that Jessica Chastain acquired for her new company, Freckle Films, which is female-led movies, women's stories. And I'm super excited that they're working on it. They're developing it to be a movie.
That is going to be so cool. I mean, I think it's every author's dream is to have a movie made, and this one deserves a movie just as well. I mean, I pray somebody makes this into a movie, because, and especially right now, I feel like we're finding, like with Wonder Woman, we're finding a lot of female-led movies that are doing so well before they'd say, oh, they're not going to do well because it's but that's not the case anymore. I mean,
no, Hidden Figures, Oscar winning, true story, like stuff that we wish we had learned in our history books, but we never did. We can learn. And people read books, and that's a great way to get the word out. But to have something be a movie, to be a popular movie, to be an Oscar winning movie, that's where you just millions of people.
Yeah.
So that would be amazing.
Yeah, it would be. And I did find a video that had talked about her in the fact that she had saved Abraham Lincoln's life. And I was like, well, yeah, those are the stories we didn't hear of in school. Like, we only hear about the one where he dies. We didn't get to hear about the one that he escaped.
We know that guy. Let's stop talking about John Wilkes Booth and start talking about Kate Warne and the other Pinkertons who, made sure he didn't die before the Civil War even started.
That's right. Well, I felt, like I told you, I listened to this, and because I was doing a lot of driving this month, so I had a lot of Audible going on, and I know you probably don't have much impact on who gets to do the Audible, but that woman did amazing, and I don't know if you've been told this before, but I loved her. She had the accents down. She had the different characters. You could tell by her voice who was talking. That's hard. It's really hard to get it, because I listen all the time to books.
Yeah, and I've started listening to a lot of audiobooks too, and sometimes the narrator takes a good book and makes it even better, and sometimes a narrator takes a great book and makes you not want to listen to it because of something that they do with the voices, especially men doing women's voices and women doing men's voices. It's really hard. It's a real skill. Yeah. And so it sounds like I lucked out. I can't listen to my own audiobooks for about a couple of years. I very recently listened to The Magician's Lie. And so I'm relying on accounts like yours to let me know whether she did the job that she needed to do. So it's good to hear that.
Yeah, and I did leave a review for her because I always think that helps them too,
Mhm.
because they have their job too is also to do this. So I like to help those people, the narrators, out with that, because it would be a task for you to take on. I mean, I hear, because I always think, why doesn't the author do it? But authors tell me, like, that's not an easy thing to do. It takes a long time to, you know? So that's why they don't.
Skills that we might not have. Like, I like to read when I do bookstore readings. I love to read a short section,
Right.
but there's some stuff that lends itself to my voice, and there's some stuff that doesn't. So a professional who knows how to do it and sustain it and do the emotional modulation and stuff, they're worth their weight in gold. So I let them do their thing, and I do my thing.
That's right. So Allan Pinkerton, I want to hear your take on him because I actually couldn't find that much out about him. It's amazing because the agency itself is popular, but to know him, and you did such a great job in bringing him to life. I mean, what did you find out? Like, what was his story? From how, I mean, I know some of it, but I'd like to hear like what his real gig was, with how he started it.
He really has an amazing story. Like, you can't make this stuff up. Like, he emigrated from Scotland to the Chicago area. He was a cooper, so he made barrels, and he was out one day in the forest getting wood for his barrels, and he stumbled across a counterfeiting ring, and then ended up helping bring those counterfeiters to justice. And then the Chicago Police Department gave him a job. And from there, he established his own private detective agency, and there still is a Pinkerton agency today. Like, they've morphed into a security agency. They changed over time, but for a very long period, they were the people who came and helped you if you needed something. They were foiling train robberies. They were chasing down, Jesse James. In a certain period in American history, they were the good guys. And then they became the bad guys later when they sort of started working for the corporate side and strike breaking and stuff like that. So Pinkerton means a lot of different things to different people. But while he was alive, Allan Pinkerton was really controlling the story by making sure that there were positive articles in the newspaper about the things that the Pinkertons were doing. He was writing books or having books written about all the cases they had solved. So he was like a really good PR guy at the time. So for people who know the name Allan Pinkerton and don't know the name Kate Warne, that's one of the big reasons. Is Kate was too busy working to promote herself. But Allan thought that part of his job was promoting himself because his name was on the agency. So he was really interesting. And did develop a lot of these things that we now think of as standard police work, just the early methods of gathering evidence and interviews, keeping case files on people. A lot of that was done in its earliest form, not by the police department, but by the Pinkerton agency.
Right. And I love her story. I love how, that Kate walks into his office, and as a woman, I mean, if you even try to imagine, and that's what I love about finding women like this, because we think it's so recent, but there were women that were real pioneers in working and being really successful at working. And I was thinking about her today because I love how she just walked in and she stated her case as to why he needed a woman. And he was like, oh, okay. And I was like, I did do something very uncomfortable today. And I was like, you know what? I'm never going to get it if I don't just ask. So, it's like, yeah, sometimes you just have to go out there. And she did. And I don't know if she thought he was going to say yes or not. I mean, maybe she was ready for a no, but she did, and not only that, I mean, everything she did, he was a pioneer, and then she was a pioneer. For how, how many cases they solved, and you go into it, and I'm not going to ruin this story because this story is so good. I mean, even if it wouldn't be history, it is such a great story. And I love the ending. I love your last line, and nobody look, okay? I'm always tempted to read the last page. Don't read the last page. Just wait till you get there because it's a great ending. And, so we know there was very little information about her. Okay. You've got a couple of pictures and so you had to go with what you had. Right. And I saw somewhere I read that you had done an interview and you said that a lot of it was lost in the Chicago fire. too. Was that true?
Yes. Yeah, a lot of it. So they were a Chicago-based agency, and a lot of their records were in Chicago. So 1871, the post-1871 records that I saw, which are in the Library of Congress, and I happen to live in D.C., so it worked out great. I went to the Library of Congress and looked at the Pinkerton Agency archives. But the post-1871 stuff is a lot better than the pre-1871 stuff, partly for fire, partly because they weren't keeping records as completely, I think. So Kate, there just isn't that much Kate, which if I were a biographer would have really been upsetting. Right. But I'm a historical novelist, so it was kind of the perfect opportunity for me of all these gaps of just like to put my own spin on it, to put in my own narrative, and to give her the personality that I think she must have had in order to walk into his office and say, hey, it's 1856, and you wouldn't even put in the ad, only men should apply, because no woman would think of applying, but she did. And she walked in and she said, I'm not here for a secretary's job. I'm here to be an operative, and you need to hire me for XYZ reason. And he said yes. So we have his account of it. We don't have her account of it, but hopefully that's pretty close to the way that it happened. And yeah, so we don't have her diaries. We don't have her letters. We don't know what she really sounded like or what she was thinking, but we know some of the things that she did. And you couldn't be a woman in 1856 who walks in to get a job as a detective without being a pretty bold person with attitude and confidence. And so I've given her that. My version of Kate has those traits.
Right, and that's what I was saying. Like, I was thinking about how bold she had to be compared to how bold there are times that we have to be bold, but I look at her as like an alter ego for me. I have 6 children. I homeschooled them. I did that whole, opposite of what she did. So when I see women like her, I'm like, that's almost what I would have done. Like, had I not chosen this path, I would have chosen that path. I would have been a career woman. I would have done, things like that. And I love how you weave that into her story because of the fact that she didn't do that, and how she took that agency. I mean, that was her life. And then and then as a woman at that, okay, it's enough as a woman in this age to do that. Nobody cares. Nobody would even say too much about it to make that path. But at that time, to have that path that, I'm sure she was looked upon as like strange by other women who were like, so you aren't married and you don't have children and you don't.
What's the point of you? Like, what? Yeah, why you? And she just owned it, from what we can tell.
Yeah. So was the love story made up?
Oh, yes. Oh. So, and I won't talk too much about the love story. I see it as largely a love story between a woman and her job. But I did want to include a romantic element because I didn't think it was fair to exclude Kate from that, that form of expression. Like maybe she did love somebody, maybe she didn't. And there are a couple of different entanglements in there that I think could have been the types of things that happened to her. But the main romance element is fictional, and it's one of the reasons I had based a character in there. And it's in the author's note at the end, so people can figure out what I'm talking about pretty easily. But one of the main characters is based and inspired by a real Pinkerton agent, but partly because there was never any evidence of the two of them having a romance, I didn't use the same name. I said, okay, it's inspired by this guy, but it's not really that guy.
Right. Well, I love that you included it because it did make her more human. Because up until that point in the story, I'm thinking she's like this, like not human in that way. It's like, oh, didn't she ever feel any, she had to fight off all these men who didn't think she was any good. She had to be so strong and so bold. And you're thinking, where, did she ever not have those? Of course she did. She had to have. So I'm really glad because I thought it made her really even more likable than, thinking that she didn't have any, because I would assume she did too. How can you not? So, and, she's around a lot of men too. So, but
all the time, all the time.
And was that Abraham Lincoln story? I mean, like I said, I found something on YouTube. It was kind of a kid's story where, like somebody did this, like, story about her, and it was very short. It was like 5 minutes. And I was thinking, well, then it must have been an account somewhere. Was it his records that you found that story? Or, did you find it on your own in your research?
About the assassination attempt?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been covered in a few different places. There's a 2014 nonfiction book by a guy named Daniel Stashower called The Hour of Peril, and so that was my main source. That it talked about not just her, but Allan Pinkerton was involved, Timothy Webster was involved, Hattie Lawton was involved. These different Pinkerton agents, how they found out about the plot against Lincoln, how they helped foil the plot against Lincoln. And the Pinkertons were working very heavily with the railroads at the time. And so that's how they figured out, they thought the South was going to try to cut telegraph lines and interrupt railroad traffic. And they heard some of that, but then they also heard people saying, oh, well, when Lincoln gets off the train in Baltimore on his way to his inauguration, we're going to kill him. And so they said, nope, no, you're not. So, so that was heavily based on real nonfiction accounts. And I we don't know exactly what they said to each other. We don't know who, moved where and what, but we do know that Lincoln was disguised as an invalid. They put a soft hat on him. They wanted him to shave, but he wouldn't because he was getting inaugurated like the next day. So he wanted to look like himself when he became president of the United States. So we do know that he was disguised as an invalid and Kate was disguised as his sister and escorted him from one train to another to make sure that he got onto the train in D.C.
And it's interesting to think of, we know what Abraham Lincoln looks like and how big of a man he was. I mean, to picture him, in a wheelchair, like he is a hard person to hide, I would imagine.
Yes. Yeah. So they did what they could.
They did what they could with him. Exactly. Well, I love that part of the story. And, that it just, I don't know. You just did a really good job with it. It was a very good part of the story. I mean, all the stories, all the things that she did, all the detective work. I mean, it was crazy to think about the different personalities. And what's really interesting is I did an interview last week with a guy who was actually an undercover cop in England. And he did this huge thing that he went undercover for like 2 years. And he had a really hard time coming out. Okay. And I was thinking, well, with her, like she was she was on the opposite. She had to keep thinking about who she was because she wasn't just one person undercover. She was like all these different personalities undercover, And like you said, they are the ones that probably pioneered a lot of that stuff way before their time, before anybody else was even thinking about that, Yeah. So that was pretty awesome too. But anyway, in this day and age, you don't get away with trying to intercept like communication that way.
No, it's a whole different. And like, if you just showed up and said that your name was one thing and nobody recognizes you, there aren't pictures, there aren't, you could easily go to one place and be like, oh yeah, my name is Mrs. Farley and I'm from Alabama, and then show up halfway across town the next day using a completely different name. And chances are that you would not be caught. But they were going into danger and they were, running real risks. And some Pinkerton agents were caught and executed during the Civil War. So it was very risky stuff, and they were really putting their lives on the line.
Right.
So I wanted to pay respect to that.
Oh yeah, and yeah, absolutely. So how did you get involved in historical fiction writing? I mean, first of all, that is my favorite genre. That's why I was so excited. And I'm sorry for stalking you a little bit, because I really stalked you. Because I really did, because I was like, no, I have to talk about this book. It is so amazing. And I just kept emailing you. I was like, I'll find her. I'll get her when she gets a chance,
Worked out great. So historical fiction, I completely accidentally began writing historical fiction because of The Magician's Lie. So I think it's right there. Because I came up with this idea. I thought, I've seen countless references to male magicians cutting women in half, and why have I never seen anything in my entire life about a female magician cutting a man in half? And I started to research it and found out that really the first time that became a signature act for a female illusionist was in the 1980s. So I thought, well, I could write a book about this woman in the 1980s, but that's her story. I could write a book about a modern current magician, but that would be like a Vegas kind of thing. I wanted to write about the height of magic, where a female magician was, first of all, very unusual, and second of all, could make front page news by doing something really, surprising.
Right.
And so when I got into the research, I figured out I needed to set the book between about 1895 and 1905.
Right.
And so I did. And so And then my first thought was, I don't know anything about 1895 to 1905. Like, did they have electricity? I'm pretty sure they didn't have cars, but how did they get around? And, my character is going to put on a hat. What does it look like? Did they wear gloves? And so there was just constant, I had to do so much work just to get to the level where I was describing scenes that kind of made sense. Mm-hmm. So that was, my first book was a real challenge in that way. So it took about 5 years for me to figure out how to do that and to get it right. And then also the Magician's Lie goes back and forth between 2 time frames. So it's complicated in the writing and in the rewriting. Kate's story is much more clean and straightforward. So that was a lot faster. But in both of them, the reason that I love writing and reading historical fiction is the sense of transporting you somewhere. And so when I was writing Girl in Disguise, I had the research on Kate, which wasn't very much. I read about other types of cases that the Pinkertons were solving at the time. But then I really wanted to get into Chicago and Richmond and all of the places that she goes. What was it like to be there? What did it smell like? What did it look like? Who were the other people who were there at the time? And so that research takes a lot of time, and you have to figure out exactly how much of it to put in the book. Because I could have, spent pages and pages and pages. She goes to Richmond. How many pages do I spend describing Richmond, and how many pages do I describe what she's actually doing, and how do I paint the picture for you without slowing the action down too much and just interrupting the action with, well, there was this hotel and it was 3 blocks down from the slave market and the teacups looked like this. And it's really hard to just sort of get exactly the right level of detail in there in order to transport the reader, but keep the story moving.
Yeah. And you really did. I mean, seriously. I mean, even listening, because Audible, I find very difficult. It can slow. I mean, stories sometimes go slower through Audible, which is why I prefer to read if I have the time. But I did not find that at all with the Audible. So which tells me that even reading it, I mean, it would have been like, such a page turner. I thought you gave us just enough, to get that. I did feel transported back to that time. There's so little that we know about that time of what it was like to just move around, not just...
Yeah.
Like just the moving around. I was like, oh, I never really thought about that. I've never really thought about how did they get from point A to point B and the whole train thing. And as that was all coming out. And so I really loved that part. But I mean, to have your first book turn into that is going to be made into a movie. And then your second book, I mean, that has just been, it must be overwhelming. I can't even, I talk to so many authors and they, it'll be like their 10th book. It won't be, but their first book. That's just amazing to me that you were able to accomplish that. So,
Well, and you qualified it earlier, first published book. It is definitely not the first one I wrote. So it does take a while. And I think it's a blessing in some ways to not get early success because, those early books just sit and they'll probably never be published anywhere or go anywhere. But I learned so much from everything else that I wrote that then ends up making these books better. Right. So I'm feeling good with the way that things. It wasn't fun at the time. It wasn't fun. Well, like, why can't I get published? But where I am now, I feel very lucky and very happy to be living my life this way.
Did you pick the titles? Because both of those titles are so good. Like when I saw A Girl in Disguise, I was like, oh, what a great title that is.
Well, both of them were collaborations. Neither of them was the original title that I came up with, but my agent and my editor and I sort of sat down and brainstormed in person on the first one and over the phone on the second one to say, hey, what are some possible titles that we might use? How do you feel about this? How do you feel about that? We really wanted to get disguise in there because it is, that's such an important part of it, both when she's a detective and when she's a spy. So we needed to get that in there. And The Magician's Lie I'm particularly happy with just because it almost poses a question. It makes you as a reader distrust her as a narrator. You're like, oh, well, she's lying. So what's the lie? Right. And is there really only one? So I'm really glad that we landed on that because there's so little information that you as a reader have when you're trying to decide what book to read. So you'll get the title, you'll see the cover, you might, read a blurb from another author or see the little description. You might flip it open and read the first page. But if you're not grabbed by any of those things, you got a million other books that you could be reading with that same time or listening to or whatever. So titles are really important. And so we work very hard to try to make sure that they say the right thing.
Yeah. And, titles and covers, like I talk to a lot of readers and they're like, oh, it doesn't matter to me. They can be titled. And I'm like, oh my gosh, not me. Like I saw Girl in Disguise on Facebook and I was like, who is that? I want to read that. Look at that cover. That's amazing cover. Like they totally pull me in. I mean, I have to say, I am that person that looks at a cover and I'm like, yes, I want to read that book, So I think when you guys can get covers and titles like that, it just takes your book to a whole other level and gets that reader. I mean, even I didn't get it in a bookstore, but if I were to see those books in the bookstore, they would grab my attention right away. The colors and everything. I mean, everything plays into it, So
my publisher does amazing covers. I've been really lucky.
Oh my God. I know. Just even looking at them behind you, I'm like, they're such great covers. It's amazing. Okay. So burning question. What is next?
What is next? I am working on a third book. So I'm on about a once every 2 years cycle because Girl in Disguise came out this spring in hardcover and ebook, and it comes out next spring in paperback. And then the spring after that is when my next book is coming out. So I actually have not even finished it. It's due in a couple of months, but it's inspired by the newspaper woman Nellie Bly, who did some really, really interesting things in the late 1880s. And one of the things that she did is she went undercover in an insane asylum. To expose the conditions that inmates were experiencing there. So my character is not Nellie Bly, and she goes undercover in an insane asylum for different reasons, but that's the setting that I chose. So it's 1888 San Francisco and Northern California, which is a whole new area and a new time period for me. So it's been a lot of research, but I've got this character that I'm in the zone and I'm loving her. And she's a little bit different than the other two. That my other two protagonists have really been those bold, forthright women. They take control and they don't let go. And this one sort of has to grow into being that kind of woman. She's much younger and she's really trying to sort of figure things out and to be thrown into this, really challenging environment. But one of the things that I learned from reading Nellie Bly's 10 Days in a Madhouse is that so many of the women in the insane asylums of that time were not crazy. They were just women who were inconvenient or needed to be, shoved off to the side in some way, or they didn't speak English, or, getting somebody committed was easier than divorcing them. And so she really lands in this group of women who are very interesting. Some of them are dangerous. Some of them are just interesting. And so that's been a really fun cast of characters to write. And so it is also sort of a bigger, broader book with more characters than the last one.
Do you start with a really solid outline before? I mean, you've got to do a lot of research for these books, a lot, to get in there. So after you're done researching, do we start off with a very solid outline of how you want it? Because I know with Girl in Disguise, like, I did not know where you were. Seriously, I did not know where you were going. And in a weird way, I was thinking, okay, if you're going to go now hers is chronological. Okay. Mm-hmm. So it's like, to write that outline of it building, I'm thinking, what if she doesn't have a good ending? Like, what happens to, she did. She had a great ending. So it just worked, you worked it. I mean, you work it that it does, but you have to make that outline so solid that do you, as you're doing the outline, do you, know where you're going when you actually sit down to write the words? Or yeah, you do. Right?
I do and I don't. So I always do a synopsis first. At least with these last two, they've both been sold on an outline, on a synopsis. Okay. So I've written the first couple of chapters. I have an outline that says, hey, this is all the stuff that's going to happen in this book. But it's, it's maybe a page or two long. It's not, I have a friend who does 50-page outlines. So she has much less to do between the outline and the actual finished book than I do. I start out with my synopsis and I know this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens. I know what I'm writing toward. I have the ending in mind from the very beginning. So I know my beginning, I know my ending. Middle can be all sorts of crazy, but I know what I'm writing toward. And I always do start with an outline, and I always do change it along the way. Kate changed a lot less than The Magician's Lie, and then the one that I'm working on now. The one that I'm working on now has had a lot more stuff added into the middle, just because I'm in love with these characters, and I want to make sure that it's not just one main character and then sort of a little color commentary around the side. I want all of the women there to sort of tell their stories and have some breath and some life in them. And so when I develop my characters more, that means more plot, that means more action, in order to sort of avoid the pitfalls that we were talking about earlier of halting the action in order to describe things. So you're learning about the characters by things that they do, and the things that one character does affect the other characters. And so the middle of the book kind of grows and grows, while we're still aiming for that same ending.
Yeah, and I love how her relationship with Allan Pinkerton grew. You know, how it got really kind of sweet. And, you know, I loved watching that relationship also grow. So just wanted to mention that in the middle of it. But anyway, so are you still on book tour at all?
I'm doing a few events here and there. I actually have an event coming up this coming weekend. It'll be over by the time this comes to YouTube, yes. But I'm going up to Ann Arbor for a festival there. And then I've got some, just a few sort of local things sprinkled around this fall. And then probably next spring, when the book comes out in paperback, I'll probably go out on the road again. Because it's fun. Yeah. I can't for too long because I have young kids at home. But I love getting out and meeting readers and just being at bookstores and meeting the booksellers who, you know, are so passionate about this stuff. It's really a lot of fun.
Yeah. And I'm trying to get to more book signings. You know, especially now that I'm starting to know you guys, like I'm trying to follow. I'm in Pennsylvania, so it's like whenever I can find somebody in the area just to go get my book signed and, you know, meet everybody. So they are a lot of fun. I mean, it's so much fun to meet the authors. But, you know, I figured this is like second best because then they can still see you if they can't get to one of your events. So.
Yes. Yeah. Right.
But I will have all your links below for everybody to be able to find you and find the books. And I am so happy that we got this chance to talk. I was very excited about this. So thank you so much for, you know, talking with me. And I loved Girl in Disguise. I really did. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for hosting me. I really appreciate it.
Okay. You have a great night, Greer.
Bye. Thanks. Bye.